Hyun Park's heart stopped when she saw the bright red F on her quantum physics test. She blinked twice, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the failing grade remained there, bold and ugly against the white paper. The classroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the space station's life support systems. Through the large windows, Saturn's rings glowed orange in the distant sunlight. Usually, this view made Hyun feel lucky to be studying at the Interstellar Academy of Sciences, but today it only reminded her how far she was from home. She looked at her test answers again. Every single one was correct. She was sure of it. She had studied for weeks, spending long hours in the library after classes. She had even helped other students understand the material during study groups. There was no way she deserved this grade. At 18 years old, Hyun was the youngest student in her class. Her long black hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the standard academy uniform, a dark blue jumpsuit with silver trim. Around her neck hung a turquoise necklace, a gift from her Cherokee grandmother back on Earth. The stone felt warm against her skin as she took deep breaths to stay calm. Professor Lee Dong-gil stood at the front of the classroom, his expensive suit making him stand out among the students in their uniforms. He was writing something on the floating holographic board, purposely ignoring the confused looks from his students as they received their grades. Professor Lee. Hyun's voice was steady despite her racing heart. I think there might be a mistake with my grade. The professor turned slowly, his face showing no emotion. He was tall and thin, with perfectly combed gray hair and small round glasses that made him look like an owl, a very unfriendly owl. There is no mistake, Ms. Park. Your understanding of quantum physics is insufficient. Hyun stood up, holding her test paper. Other students were watching now, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. But sir, I can explain every answer. Look at question 4 about quantum entanglement. My solution matches the textbook exactly. Professor Lee's lips turned down in a small frown. The textbook provides basic answers, Ms. Park. I expect my students to show deeper understanding. He paused, looking at her grandmother's necklace with disapproval. Perhaps if you spent more time studying than less time, expressing your heritage, your grades would improve. The classroom went very quiet. Even the usual chatter from the hallway seemed to stop. Hyun felt her cheeks grow hot, but she didn't look away. She had dealt with comments like this before, but never so openly, and never from a teacher. My heritage has nothing to do with my understanding of physics, she said clearly, and I can prove every answer on this test is correct. A few seats away, Ba Jai-ho shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was holding his own test paper with a bright A+ marked at the top. Hyun had helped him study last week, and she could see that his answers were exactly the same as hers. Professor Lee smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Ms. Park, this is a prestigious institution. We have certain standards. Not everyone is suited for advanced theoretical physics. Perhaps you would be more comfortable in a different program. Hyun's hands tightened on her test paper. She thought about her journey to get here. Growing up in Oklahoma, she had always loved science. Her Korean mother was a doctor, and her Cherokee father taught biology at the local high school. They had encouraged her curiosity, teaching her that knowledge belonged to everyone. She remembered staying up late as a child, watching the stars through her father's telescope. She remembered her grandmother's stories about how everything in nature was connected, just like the quantum particles she now studied. She remembered the day she received her acceptance letter to the academy, how proud her whole family had been. Looking around the classroom, Hyun saw the other students' faces. Many looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. The walls of the classroom were made of smart glass, currently set to transparent mode. Outside, transport pods zipped between the station's different sections, carrying people from all over Earth and its colonies. The academy was supposed to be a place where humanity's best minds came together, regardless of where they came from. I earned my place here, Hyun said firmly, and I can demonstrate my understanding of quantum physics any way you want to test it. Professor Lee's smile disappeared. Your attitude is not helping your case, Miss Park. The grade stands. Class dismissed. Students began gathering their things, her room filling with the sounds of bags zipping and chairs moving. Hei-yun remained standing, her test papers still in her hands. She watched as Bai Jiho hurried past her, not meeting her eyes. His test paper showed identical answers to hers, but very different results. As everyone filed out, Hei-yun slowly packed her tablet and notebooks into her bag. Her hands were steady now, but her mind was racing. This wasn't just unfair, it was wrong. And she had proof. The academy required all classes to be recorded for quality control and future reference. Every test had to be scanned and stored in the central database. Every grade had to be justified with clear reasoning. These rules were meant to protect both students and teachers. Now they would help her prove what was really happening. Hei-yun walked to the door, then stopped and turned back. Professor Lee was erasing the holographic board, his back to her. "Professor," she said quietly, "my grandmother taught me that justice is like water. It always finds its way through." The professor didn't turn around, but his hand paused in midair. "Your grandmother's wisdom won't help you pass this class, Miss Park. I suggest you think carefully about your future here." Hei-yun left the classroom, her grandmother's necklace warm against her skin. The station's main corridor stretched out before her, its curved ceiling showing a real-time view of space above. Streams of students moved in both directions, their uniforms marking them as future scientists, engineers, and explorers. She touched her tablet, pulling up the student handbook. There were procedures for grade disputes, ways to report discrimination, channels for filing official complaints. But she would need more than just her word. She would need evidence. Opening her class schedule, she saw she had advanced theoretical physics with Professor Kim Sun-woo next. Professor Kim was known for being strict but fair. More importantly, he was the head of the department. If anyone could help her fight this injustice, it would be him. Hei-yun straightened her shoulders and started walking. Her feet made soft sounds on the station's metallic floor, joining the rhythm of hundreds of other students pursuing their dreams among the stars. She thought about all the barriers that had been broken to allow her to be here. Her mother leaving Korea to study medicine in America, her father fighting to be taken seriously as a Native American scientist, her grandmother maintaining their traditions in a changing world. She wouldn't let one prejudiced professor stop her. She wouldn't let him win. The failing grade in her bag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but Hei-yun walked with her head high. She had learned about forces in physics, how every action had an equal and opposite reaction. Professor Lee had just started something he wouldn't be able to stop. As she walked, she pulled up the class recordings on her tablet. She would go through every session, document every interaction, compare every grade. She would show that science didn't care about someone's background, it only cared about what was true. The stars shone steadily through the station's transparent ceiling, ancient light traveling across vast distances to reach them. Hei-yun thought about how many of humanity's great discoveries had come from people who were told they didn't belong, who were told to stay in their place. She thought about how many times progress had come from those who refused to accept artificial limitations. She reached Professor Kim's classroom early, wanting to catch him before the next class started. Through the smart glass walls, she could see him preparing for his lecture, his artificial eyes glowing softly as he reviewed holographic data displays. Hei-yun took a deep breath and touched her grandmother's necklace one last time. Then she walked through the door, ready to fight for her future among the stars. She knew this wouldn't be easy. The Academy's political landscape was as complex as any quantum system she studied. But she also knew that truth, like light, couldn't be contained forever. It would find its way out, one way or another. And when it did, everything would change. Professor Kim Sun-woo's artificial eyes glowed softly as he studied Hei-yun's test paper. The blue light from his cybernetic implants moved back and forth across the page, scanning every detail. Hei-yun sat quietly in his office, watching his face for any reaction. Outside the window, transport pods flew past against the backdrop of Saturn's rings. "Every answer is correct," Professor Kim said finally. He placed the test paper on his desk, next to a small plant that grew in a special gravity control pot. "Not just correct, they show excellent understanding of the material." Heyun nodded. "I know, sir. That's why I came to you." She reached into her bag and pulled out her tablet. "And I have more evidence." Professor Kim leaned forward in his chair. Unlike Professor Lee's expensive suit, he wore the same uniform as his students, believing teachers should not set themselves apart. His artificial eyes adjusted their focus as Heyun activated her tablet's holographic display. "First, here are the class recordings," she said. A three-dimensional image appeared above the tablet, showing Professor Lee's classroom from multiple angles. "I've marked every time Professor Lee ignored my raised hand, criticized my answers unfairly, or made comments about my background." The professor watched carefully as Heyun played several clips. In each one, Professor Lee's bias became clearer and clearer. He would praise simple answers from certain students while dismissing Heyun's more detailed explanations. He would make small comments about traditional thinking versus modern science whenever she spoke. "Now, here's something else," Heyun continued. She pulled up another file. "This is Bai Jiho's test from the same day." The hologram showed two test papers side by side, hers and Jiho's. "Our answers are identical. He got an A+. I got an F." Professor Kim stood up and walked to his window. The space station's curved hull stretched out below them, its metal surface reflecting the distant sunlight. He was quiet for a long moment. "What you're suggesting is very serious," he said finally. "Professor Lee has been teaching here for 20 years. He has powerful friends on the academy board." Heyun felt her heart sink, but she didn't give up. "I understand, sir, but isn't truth more important than politics? Isn't that what science is about?" The professor turned back to her, a small smile on his face. "You sound like your father. I read his papers on biological adaptation in space colonies. Very innovative work. You know my father's research." Heyun was surprised. "I make it a point to know the background of all my students," Professor Kim said. "Your mother's work on low-gravity surgery techniques is equally impressive. And your Cherokee heritage." He gestured to her necklace. "Many of humanity's greatest discoveries came from combining different ways of seeing the world." Heyun touched her grandmother's necklace, feeling more hopeful. "Then you'll help me." Professor Kim sat back down at his desk. "Show me everything you have. Leave no detail out. If we're going to challenge someone like Professor Lee, we need to be absolutely prepared." For the next 2 hours, Heyun presented all her evidence. She showed more class recordings, test comparisons, and grade records. She had collected data from other minority students who had taken Professor Lee's classes in previous years. The pattern was clear. Students of certain backgrounds consistently received lower grades, no matter how well they performed. "There's one more thing," Heyun said, pulling up a final file. "I analyzed Professor Lee's research papers from the past 5 years. Look at his citation patterns." Professor Kim's artificial eyes scanned the data. "He only cites researchers from certain countries and backgrounds," he said slowly, "even when their work isn't the most relevant to his topic. And he completely ignores major breakthroughs from scientists who don't fit his preferred profile." Heyun added, "Some of these ignored papers have changed entire fields of study." The professor stood up again, but this time with purpose. "Wait here," he said. He walked to a wall panel and pressed his hand against it. A hidden door slid open, revealing a small room filled with old-fashioned paper files. "The Academy keeps backup records of everything," he explained, pulling out several folders. "Paper copies that can't be altered or deleted. Let's compare them to the digital records." They spent another hour going through the paper files. The evidence became even stronger. In some cases, Professor Lee had actually changed digital grades after submitting the paper versions, always to the disadvantage of certain students. This is more than just bias, Professor Kim said, his artificial eyes glowing brighter with concern. This is systematic discrimination. He's been deliberately holding back promising students based on their background. Hae-yun felt angry, but also sad. How many careers has he damaged? How many students gave up because they thought they weren't good enough? Professor Kim gathered all the evidence into a neat pile. That stops now. But we need to be smart about this. The Academy Board will want to avoid scandal. They might try to quietly move Professor Lee to another position instead of addressing the real problem. What can we do? Hae-yun asked. We make it impossible to ignore, the professor said. He pressed a button on his desk, and a large holographic screen appeared on the wall. I'm calling an emergency meeting of the board. But first, we need to prepare your presentation carefully. They worked together as the station's day cycle turned to night. They organized the evidence, prepared clear explanations, and anticipated possible questions or challenges. Professor Kim taught Hae-yun about academy politics and procedures, helping her understand the best way to present her case. Remember, he said as they finished, you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every student who comes after you, for everyone who dreams of studying among the stars. Hae-yun looked out at those stars through the office window. She thought about her grandmother's stories of standing up against injustice, about her parents breaking barriers in their own fields. She thought about all the future students who deserved a fair chance. When is the board meeting? She asked. Professor Kim checked his tablet. Tomorrow morning. It's short notice, but that works in our favor. Professor Lee won't have time to prepare his defense or call in favors. Hae-yun gathered her things, feeling both nervous and determined. Thank you, Professor Kim, for believing me, for helping me. The professor smiled, his artificial eyes gentle. Thank you for having the courage to speak up. Sometimes the most important scientific discoveries come from questioning what everyone else accepts as normal. As Hae-yun walked back to her dormitory pod, the station's nighttime lighting made everything look soft and blue. Other students were heading to evening study sessions or social gatherings. None of them knew that tomorrow might change everything at the academy. In her small room, Hae-yun practiced her presentation one more time. Her tablet displayed the evidence in clear, undeniable patterns. The truth was on her side. Now she just had to make sure everyone else saw it too. She touched her grandmother's necklace and looked out her window at the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was exploring new worlds, making new discoveries. Those discoveries didn't care about the explorer's background or heritage. They only cared about curiosity, dedication, and truth. Tomorrow, she would make sure the academy remembered that too. The academy boardroom was bigger than Hae-yun had imagined. 12 members sat around a large circular table, their chairs floating slightly above the floor using anti-gravity technology. The walls were made of smart glass, currently showing a spectacular view of Saturn's rings, but Hae-yun knew they could become screens for presentations at any moment. She stood at the entrance, holding her tablet tightly. Professor Kim stood beside her, his artificial eyes glowing with encouragement. On the other side of the room, Professor Lee sat in a chair near the board members. He looked calm, but Hae-yun noticed his fingers tapping nervously on his expensive suit. Please come in, Ms. Park, said Dr. Yang Mei-rei, the board chairperson. She was an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. We understand you have serious concerns to present to us. Hae-yun walked to the center of the room. Her academy uniform felt stiff and formal, but her grandmother's turquoise necklace gave her comfort. She took a deep breath and activated her tablet's holographic display. Honorable board members, she began, her voice clear and steady. I'm here today because of a serious problem at our academy. A problem that goes against everything we stand for as scientists and explorers. The room's smart glass walls changed to display mode as Hae-yun started sharing her evidence. First, she showed the class recordings. The board members watched carefully as Professor Lee repeatedly dismissed her correct answers while praising simpler responses from other students. "Now, please look at these test results," Hye-yeon continued. She displayed her test paper next to Ba Jae-ho's. "Identical answers, very different grades. And this isn't just about me." More evidence appeared on the walls. Charts and graphs showed how Professor Lee had systematically given lower grades to students from certain backgrounds. The paper records from Professor Kim's archive proved that digital grades had been changed after submission. Professor Lee stood up suddenly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You can't possibly believe the complaints of one struggling student. I have 20 years of experience teaching quantum physics." "Please sit down, Professor Lee," Dr. Yang said firmly. "Ms. Park has the floor." Hye-yeon continued, showing more evidence. She displayed Professor Lee's research papers, revealing his pattern of only citing scientists from certain backgrounds. She showed statistics about how many promising students had left the academy after taking his classes. The board members were talking quietly among themselves now. Some looked angry, others seemed shocked. Professor Lee's face had gone pale, but he was writing something quickly on his own tablet. "This is more than just unfair grading," Hye-yeon said. "This is about the future of science itself. How many brilliant minds have we lost because someone decided they didn't fit the right profile?" "Enough." Professor Lee jumped up again. "You want to talk about the future of science? Then prove yourself right now." He pressed something on his tablet, and a new hologram appeared in the center of the room. "The Nakamura paradox," he announced with a cruel smile. "If Ms. Park truly understands quantum physics at the level she claims, let her solve it, in front of everyone." The room went very quiet. The Nakamura paradox was famous, a complex problem in quantum mechanics that had stopped scientists from building stable wormhole gates. No one had solved it completely, especially not a student. "Professor Lee," Dr. Yang started. "That's not appropriate." "No," Hye-yeon interrupted. "I'll do it." Professor Kim touched her shoulder. "Hye-yeon, you don't have to prove anything. The evidence speaks for itself." But Hye-yeon was already walking toward the hologram. The complex quantum equations floated in the air, glowing blue and challenging. She had studied the paradox before, fascinated by its puzzle. More importantly, she had thought about it differently than others. "My grandmother taught me something important," she said, reaching for the holographic controls. "She said that in nature, everything finds its balance if you let it. Fighting against that balance only creates more problems." Her fingers moved through the hologram, adjusting equations and adding new ones. Everyone tries to solve the Nakamura paradox by forcing the quantum states to align. But what if we work with their natural tendencies instead? The room was completely silent now. Even Professor Lee had stopped writing. The board members leaned forward in their floating chairs, watching as Hye-yeon worked. She thought about her heritage, her Korean mother's precise medical knowledge, her Cherokee father's understanding of natural systems, her grandmother's wisdom about balance and harmony. Different ways of seeing the world that came together to create something new. In quantum mechanics, we talk about particles being connected across space, she explained as she worked. But we forget that they're also connected across cultures and perspectives. Every way of understanding the universe adds to our knowledge. The equations were changing now, shifting into new patterns. Hye-yeon added symbols representing natural resonance patterns, ideas she had developed while thinking about her grandmother's teachings about harmony in nature. Professor Lee started to say something, but Dr. Yang held up her hand to silence him. The hologram was beginning to pulse with a new kind of energy. "The paradox exists because we're trying to control something that doesn't want to be controlled," Hye-yeon said. "But if we create conditions that allow quantum states to find their own balance." She made one final adjustment. The hologram flashed brightly, then settled into a perfect, stable pattern. The quantum equations had aligned themselves, finding a natural harmony that no one had seen before. The room erupted in excitement. Board members stood up, talking all at once. Professor Kim's artificial eyes were glowing brighter than ever. Even Dr. Yang looked amazed. Impossible, Professor Lee whispered. This can't be right. Check it yourself, Hei-yun said calmly. The math proves it. The universe doesn't care about our prejudices or preferences. It only cares about what's true. Dr. Yang stood up, raising her hands for quiet. Professor Lee, she said, her voice stern. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The professor looked around the room, but he found no support in any face. His shoulders slumped. No, he said quietly. No, I don't. Then this board will take immediate action, Dr. Yang announced. Professor Lee, you are suspended from teaching pending a full investigation. Ms. Park, your grade will be corrected, and we will review all of Professor Lee's past grading decisions. Hei-yun felt relief wash over her, but she wasn't finished. What about the other students? The ones who left because they were made to feel they didn't belong? Dr. Yang nodded. We will contact each one. They will be offered the chance to return, with full scholarships if they wish. The academy must make this right. As the board members began discussing details, Professor Kim led Hei-yun out of the room. In the hallway, other students had gathered, having heard about the emergency meeting. They started clapping when they saw her. You did more than prove him wrong, Professor Kim said proudly. You showed everyone that the best science comes from being open to all ways of understanding the universe. Hei-yun touched her grandmother's necklace, feeling the smooth turquoise stone. She thought about all the future students who would now have a fair chance to study among the stars. The Nakamura paradox solution would change space travel forever. But more importantly, it had shown that prejudice had no place in science. The truth couldn't be held back by small minds or old biases. It would always find its way through, like water finding its path to the sea. 3 months after the board meeting, Hei-yun stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her graduation robe. The traditional blue and silver colors of the academy looked different today, brighter somehow. Her grandmother's turquoise necklace stood out beautifully against the formal outfit. The academy had changed a lot in those 3 months. After Professor Lee's removal, many things happened very quickly. The board had reviewed all his past grading decisions, reaching out to every student who had been unfairly treated. 23 former students had already returned to complete their studies, with full scholarships as promised. But the biggest change had come from Hei-yun's solution to the Nakamura paradox. Scientists from all over Earth and its colonies were now working on the first stable wormhole gate, using her breakthrough. The academy had given her special permission to graduate early and start her PhD research immediately. Are you ready? Professor Kim asked, appearing at her door. His artificial eyes glowed warmly. Everyone's waiting. Hei-yun took a deep breath and nodded. Together, they walked through the station's corridors toward the main assembly hall. The halls were packed with people, not just students and teachers, but also reporters and scientists from around the solar system. Everyone wanted to see the graduation ceremony of the student who had changed space travel forever. The assembly hall was the largest room in the academy. Today, its smart glass walls showed a spectacular view of space, with Saturn's rings serving as a natural backdrop. The floating chairs had been arranged in neat rows, filled with hundreds of people. At the front, a stage held the board members and special guests. As Hei-yun walked to her seat, she saw many familiar faces. Bai Jiaho smiled and waved. He had publicly admitted to benefiting from Professor Lee's unfair grading and was now working to help identify other cases of discrimination in scientific institutions. Other students who had faced similar problems nodded to her respectfully. But the biggest surprise was in the front row. Hei-yun's eyes filled with tears when she saw her family. Her mother and father sat proudly, wearing their own academic robes from their universities. And next to them, wearing traditional Cherokee dress, was her grandmother. Dr. Yang Mi-rae, the board chairperson, stepped up to the podium. The room went quiet as she began to speak. Today marks a special moment in the history of the Interstellar Academy of Sciences, she said. We gather not just to celebrate our graduates, but to recognize a turning point in our understanding of both science and justice. The ceremony proceeded with the usual traditions. Students received their certificates, special awards were given out, and speeches were made. But everyone was waiting for the main event. Finally, Dr. Yang spoke again. And now, I invite our youngest graduate ever to deliver this year's graduation address. Haeyun Park has taught us that true science knows no boundaries of culture, background, or heritage. She has shown us that the greatest discoveries come when we embrace all ways of understanding our universe. Haeyun walked to the podium. The turquoise necklace felt warm against her skin as she looked out at the crowd. She had practiced this speech many times, but now the words felt different. 3 months ago, I stood in a room not far from here, fighting for my right to be treated fairly, she began. Today, I stand here to talk about something bigger than one person's fight. I want to talk about the future of science itself. The room was completely silent as she continued. The universe is vast and mysterious. It speaks to us in many languages. In the language of mathematics, in the language of physics, and in the languages of all the cultures that have looked up at the stars and tried to understand them. She touched her necklace gently. My grandmother taught me that everything in nature seeks harmony. My Korean mother showed me the precision of modern medicine. My Cherokee father helped me see the connections between all living things. These different ways of seeing the world didn't confuse me. They gave me the tools to solve an impossible problem. Holographic displays appeared around the hall, showing the equations from her solution to the Nakamura paradox. When I solved this puzzle, I wasn't just using quantum physics. I was using everything I had learned from every part of my heritage. Because that's how science grows, by bringing together different perspectives, different ways of thinking. She looked at Professor Kim, whose artificial eyes glowed with pride. Some people thought diversity would weaken science. They were wrong. Diversity makes science stronger. Every culture, every background, every way of seeing the world adds something valuable to our understanding. The holographic displays changed to show the plans for the first wormhole gate. Next month, construction begins on humanity's first stable wormhole gate. It will connect Earth to the Alpha Centauri colonies in minutes instead of years. And it works because we finally learned to stop forcing quantum particles to behave the way we wanted, and instead help them find their natural harmony. Haeyun's voice grew stronger. That's the lesson we need to remember. Progress doesn't come from pushing people down or keeping them out. It comes from lifting everyone up, from letting every voice be heard, from recognizing that truth doesn't care about our prejudices. She looked at her grandmother, who was smiling proudly. There's an old Cherokee saying, "The stars are forever, but we only see them when we look up." Today, I want everyone here to look up, not just at the stars, but at our own potential. Because somewhere out there, the next great discovery is waiting, and it might come from anyone, from any background, from any culture. The room burst into applause. Students stood up, cheering. Board members nodded approvingly. Reporters' cameras flashed. But Haeyun was looking at her family, at the pride in their faces. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the main hall. Scientists from different institutes wanted to talk to Haeyun about her research. Students asked for her advice. Reporters wanted interviews, but she made sure to spend time with the returning students, the ones who had been driven away by prejudice, and were now back to follow their dreams. Later that evening, Haeyun stood with her family at one of the station's observation windows. Saturn's rings glowed beautifully in the distance. Her grandmother touched the turquoise necklace gently. "You carry our ancestors' wisdom into the stars," she said softly, "and you used it to open new paths for others to follow." Haeyun hugged her grandmother tightly. Tomorrow, she would start her PhD research. The Wormhole Gate project needed her help. There were more discoveries to make, more barriers to break, more paths to open. But tonight, she simply stood with her family, watching the stars that had always called to her. The stars that didn't care where someone came from, only where they were going. The universe was vast, and now it was a little more open to everyone who dreamed of exploring it.